Welcome everyone to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom Podcast episode number 52, and today we're going to be talking about the themes of possession in Children of Dune. And this is really seems to be a continuation sort of the podcast 51 we did, where we discussed Dune Messiah, and in Dune Messiah we kind of talked about the cults of leaders and the idea of different levels of myths in politics and religion. And we talked about the works of Bensamagos, and we also talked a bit about some Frank Herbert musings on Nixon and JFK that were kind of very interesting. So you want to go check out that podcast. We just wrapped that one up. Today we're going to focus on possession in Children of Dune. And although the obvious case of possession in Children of Dune is the story of Alia, her character arc in that, we kind of want to weave it into some psychological topics, but also some topics around sort of depth psychology in the sense of looking at the meta instincts and looking at the genomic pressures and how those kind of are, maybe Herbert was playing with other memory and the idea of Alia's possession in terms of either Jungian shadow possession or anima and animus types of possession. So we can go into those a little bit and show how Herbert's use of the Alia story arc kind of dips into those Jungian topics, and we'll show a little bit from Ayani talks about those a bit. But then there's also other themes that I feel like are related on a sort of a spectrum of possession, including and not limited to things like the other memory itself, right? So you have this idea of Alia is an abomination because her other memories possess her, but the other Reverend Mothers aren't abominations because they have some kind of difference between how Alia, the preborn, are abomination, but the Reverend Mothers with other memory, they're not abomination. So we'll kind of go into what the focusing, and I'm going to just give you guys the preview, and that's agency, right? So psychological agency, and also the idea of Jungian integration, right? Where you integration of the unconscious. So integrated unconscious versus not integrated unconscious, and those idea of these possessive voices. But then across even more than just Alia's character, there's other themes, not just with other memory. If we look at the idea of prescience and having knowledge of the future, there's also sort of a possession involved in this, whether it's Paul or Leto seeing their destiny in the future and how those destinies are not only guiding them but almost like on the rails. They can't diverge from these paths, almost like in full possession, right? Also, we're going to dive into just the really terrestrial and mundane idea of, and going back to Dune Messiah, the idea of possession by ideologies, right? So the derailing that Muad'Dib does in Dune Messiah kind of continues into Children of Dune in the idea of the demagoguery and the dogmatic nature of strict adherence to whether it's a political or a religious movement. That kind of possession robs people of maybe individual insight and individual agency again. So we'll kind of touch into all of these themes. We'll dive into sort of some of the demonic nature of possession, as well as we might call it. We'll dip a bit forward into God Emperor of Dune. We also did a podcast recently for God Emperor of Dune where we talked about this being the ethics of Frank Herbert potentially. So that might be an interesting place. A lot of what happens in Children of Dune bridges that space between the two books. So we'll jump into that. So without further ado, let's kind of walk through it. So Children of Dune was written in 1976 by Frank Herbert. It is the third book of the Dune saga written by Frank Herbert. I believe that after he wrote Children of Dune, it was sort of considered to be a trilogy at the time. But some of the main, let's go with the main themes of possession. So we've got genetic memory and ancestral possession, right? This is kind of like the main topic here. So the idea of, I want to say Alia jumps out first, but Alia is not the only preborn, right? So you have, so in Children of Dune, we've got the fallen Paul Atreides, right? He is no longer the emperor after Dune Messiah. He's gone, right? But actually he makes an appearance as this sort of desert preacher, right? And Alia is now the regent of the heirs of Paul and Cheney, which are Leto II and Ganima. So we've got the future emperor Leto II, and as the children of Paul, and Alia serves as their regent, sort of while they are coming of age. But also what's interesting about all three of those characters, Alia, Leto, and Ganima, is that they were all born with what Frank Herbert refers to as the preborn. Meaning, so in the Dune lore, let's say, the Bene Gesserit, part of the Bene Gesserit school, so the Bene Gesserit are the woman's sort of religio-monastic order of very, very skilled with their pranabindu skills, with their ability to control their body. They possess the power of voice. They are used as advisors and breeding programs with the imperial houses, but they also have their own agenda. And in the Dune novel, we see that agenda sort of at its end. But the millennia-long agenda of the Bene Gesserit was that they were trying to create a Kwisatz Haderach, which they call. And the difference between a Bene Gesserit is the Bene Gesserit have not only do they have the limited ability of some prescience, they also have ancestral memories that are awoken by ingestion of the spice melange. However, they were only able to remember the maternal line of their ancestors, I believe is how it goes. And what they were looking to breed is there's an area that the Bene Gesserit said they cannot look to, that it's too frightening to them. And I think that's looking at the depths of both the male and the female line. And there was something about that. They were able to hold on to, let's think of it like this, they're able to hold on to the signifying chain, let's call it, of the maternal line. But when they branched it out into the paternal line, they weren't ever able to relive the male memories, the Bene Gesserit. And they were trying to breed this Kwisatz Haderach who could access those memories. Now, even this in itself, the idea of having ancestral memories is almost demonic in itself, right? It's kind of a possession in and of itself, where the personalities and the wisdom of past generations, past influence, can take hold of one's consciousness in the present. I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit in our Pontos Fathom book, in Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. Let me just bring that out while we're discussing it. And I think that also Hermeticism of Hastur will kind of be interesting in this case too. But in Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, just to kind of give you guys a foil here, the concept of necromancy is strange, because if you take it on face value, a necromancer uses a spell, and this word is very key, a spell, S-P-E-L-L, right? It's a spell of some sort that allows the dead to speak, okay? Now, it sounds scary when you put it this way, right? The necromantic arts, you're speaking with the dead, you're raising the dead, right? But the word spell has a weird psychological side to it, because spell is also just writing. We spell words. And in a way, when one reads, here we have Jung's Aeon, we have the works of Herbert here. When one reads these works, especially when the authors have died, we are actually taking their thoughts that they put down into paper, and through the spelling of their writings, we are reanimating their thoughts into our minds. So in a way, the fearful view of necromancy is that somehow you're raising the dead. But we do it all the time when we read historically dead authors. Right, so there's a kind of a strange, again, this is a spectrum here. And I think what's great about world building of Frank Herbert is he takes this kind of very commonplace thing. So necromancy of Nyarlathotep, we kind of talk about those blurred lines between what is raising of the dead and what is just like learning from that which has been gone, right? So then when we think about ancestral memories, if we take it one step further, ancestral memories are also kind of resurrecting the dead, right? We have a resurrection story in Dune Messiah also with Duncan Idaho. So we'll go into Duncan Idaho again in the terms of possession. So if one is speaking with the dead, one is possessed by the dead. But one can become possessed with the if you read Malcolm X's book, you can become possessed by the injustice. You can become with the fight. You can become possessed with this, right? It's such passionate writing. You read this kind of writing, and people will be re-inspired, will be possessed by this. And this is sort of like the political movements that we see with Paul's jihad, right? He raises the Fremen out of their bondage, so to speak, under the Harkonnens, but then he unleashes them on the universe in his jihad, and that possession is now changed what maybe his initial message might have been, right? So necromancy, resurrection, all of these things are a blurred continuum, and I think possession is similar in this way, in which the other memories of past generations, we have to come up with a kind of integration or integral approach. How does one process those other memories? So with the Bene Gesserit looking to create Paul as a Kwisatz Haderach, Paul does become the Kwisatz Haderach. He has children, but we see that during the trials and tribulations of the Dune book and Dune Messiah, they have some preborn that are created, and Alia is one of them. Now, the nature of Alia's possession is the most straightforward, right? So Alia Atreides, she's sister of Paul. She's a pretty pivotal character in the form of the book, and it's a very complex kind of form of possession, because in the Dune lore, Alia, a Reverend Mother, is usually an adult woman who takes the water of life from the sand trout in the Dune sandworm process that creates spice. And this creates something called the water of life. And when they take this water of life, they drink this. And this is when they awaken their ancestral memories, right? So the Bene Gesserit have this power to awaken the ancestral memories. But the key point of the Bene Gesserit is you do it after you've already attained adulthood. So an adult has their own memories. And then once they cross into this Bene Gesserit status of becoming a sister, an official initiate, that's when the water of life can activate these other memories, they call them. And now this is definitely a contrast between self and other. It's a dichotomization of it, but it's also the way that the self integrates the other memories, because there is a self to start with. In the sense of Alia, why the Bene Gesserit call it an abomination is she's never had any self other than all of the other memories. So it's sort of like, I think it's sort of a similar argument that they would make to when's the right age to introduce something to children, right? This is a common thing, like, are they old enough? Say films that are PG or rated R films. We don't want to introduce the concepts young to the children. We want children to grow up feeling safe. We want them to develop safely. We want them to have a good foundation. And then as they get older with more adult ideas, then they can make decisions for themselves, right? And I think this is the kind of the rudimentary wisdom of the Bene Gesserit concept, where you need to have a self before you can add the other selves. And because Alia never had a self, she's always had to sort of wrestle with creating a self versus all the other memories. And so while she was in while Jessica, Paul's mother, was pregnant, she was exposed to the spice melange as a fetus, and this gave her other memories even before birth. And so this early exposure, combined with Alia's sort of position of power of the regent, makes her very susceptible to the voices. Now she's got a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressures rising up, and I want to call out some of these pressures in the podcast. We'll call them maybe animus possession, shadow possession. And then we'll also look at anima possession with Paul too, but we'll sort of start with Alia first. So as the story progresses, she starts to have these ancestral memories that she cannot, they're a cacophony of sound, right? She struggles to maintain her own identity until gradually one voice rises up from the other memories that quiets the other memories for her. But it has a demand of her. And this is like the animus possession. So animus possession, I guess you can look in the Jungian term of it. I mean, in the Jung time, I think Jung would call it something akin to the inner masculine of a female, and the is animus, and anima was like the inner feminine of the male. But I think if we take it beyond the stereotypical modes, they're more like relating functions. Right, so they think of it not as a inner gender, but think of it as a relating function. So I think the more modern interpretation is we all relate to others, and some of our relating has to do with a nurturing kind of view. Some of our relating has a feminine flair to it, and some of our relating has a masculine flair to it, right? So the idea of this is everyone has a mother and a father. So when we look at ancestral, in a Freudian sense, let's say in a Freudian sense, we get some things from our mothers and we get some things from our fathers. But then in a Jungian sense, we've got this idea more of the parent complexes, right? So if we think of, if we sort of try to adjust a bit of Frank Herbert's inspirations for Alia and ground it back into Jungian thinking, we can stick with the complexes. So the idea here might be, imagine a woman whose parents were divorced, and the mother always fought with the father. So this fighting when the woman was a child, she witnessed her mother's fighting with her father. And this will create in the woman not an inner woman, but almost an inner man, because she'll say, why doesn't my father stand up to this? Why doesn't my father react to it? Why is he so dumb? Why is he so complacent to it? Why is she so mean? So all of those questions that might arise for the female child as she grows up, they could actually form a relating function that's either well-adapted or maladapted, right? And this animus may very well be the idea of the male that that the woman now has her relating function of the male, it's internalized. And she would now expect a certain male based on her mother and father's combat, her mother and father's dysfunction. So this maladaptive animus, we'll call it, is sort of like an inner male voice to a woman who would now take this to her. So say, for example, she'd be attracted to stronger men. But on top of this, the strong men would then be shit tested because the mother would shit test the dad. And in a maladaptation, the animus almost is competing for the woman's affection with the men of the real world. So her inner animus may actually shit test the boyfriend because the inner animus sort of feels that it wants to regulate her to a homeostasis which she's comfortable with in maladaptation. So in this case, our idea is because of the parent complex of fighting parents, the animus takes on a bit of an aggressivity, and then it will shit test more, maybe to her detriment, but she is able to reach the homeostasis of a childhood in the parent complex of maladaptation, right? So what's interesting about this is, in normal psychology, obviously the woman can realize this and she can go to some therapy and understand that she doesn't need to shit test the man and blah, blah, blah. Lots of ways you can go there. But when Herbert takes this into a world building technique, you can see that this is what Alia becomes. So Alia has Duncan Idaho as her mate, but then she has the Baron Harkonnen as her sort of animus possession, who is sort of quieting the inner voices. He's even participating in their sex, right? So this sort of inner dichotomy here is very interesting, how it relates in a lot of ways to the animus possession. You also see the idea of a shadow possession too. So the shadow possession is where the side, for Jung, the shadow is the sort of the side of you that you don't want to look at, but your friends can see. You might have a friend who's say your friend is always bragging, right? And all of you know that his skills aren't great, but he's always funny the way he brags, and you kind of you don't take it so seriously because he's a likable person, right? But from his point of view, maybe he never sees his bragging. He always sees it as he's the best. But you actually know he's not. He makes mistakes. And that sort of like what's in the shadow of a person is the part of you that you deny yourself to see, right? Whether it's a dark side, whether it's an inadequacy. And this also can be a shadow possession. I think Jung famously talks about Nietzsche's shadow possession. The idea of Nietzsche questioning things like what is good and evil, and questioning the genealogy of morals, and questioning the eternal recurrence of the same, these very deep destabilizing of the ground and the foreground, and destabilizing of the moral structure, and destabilizing to the point of everything is will and power, the Schopenhauerian will. And so Nietzsche's unhinging himself was partly fueled by maybe like a Freudian death drive or something like this. And that shadow possession started to take up more and more of his mental real estate, where he started to question even his own ability to be a cohesive being. And perhaps this led to some of his, what would eventually be to his insanity, right? And I think that some aspects of this Nietzschean shadow possession is also present in Alia also, because as the Baron Harkonnen quiets the voices, now he starts to make more demands of her, like, let me be present when you're having sex with Duncan Idaho. It's one of these very creepy scenes. It's where like the Baron is actually like eavesdropping from within her consciousness. That's very, very strange, right? But this is the way demonic possession, it's very well done by Herbert. I think on the flip side, while we're talking about the animus possession, we can also talk about anima possession as well. So this might more be again, it's a relating function. So the idea of the animus possession in a woman, let's say the idea of the animus as a relating function for a woman would be, let's say in well-adapted, not maladapted usage, is it's just what the woman has, what a woman has gathered together of men from her father, from her teachers, from her male role models, and then the internalization of this animus. And now when she relates to men, she kind of has a market basket of what a good man is and what a bad man might be. And now this is the inner man that she uses to relate to men. And she can also inform her opinions around her mating choice of man. Like the ideal man will be partly informed by the good features of her father, perhaps the good features of family members, male family members, role models, even celebrities. Who knows? It could be an amalgamation of anything that a woman will construct her animus around. Ideal things of men, less ideal things of men, realistic relations of these things, and then all of those relating factors in a healthy individual becomes how a person can relate to her potential choice of partner. In the maladaptation, we've sort of talked about it, right? So the maladaptation is the flip side of that, where the maladapted animus possession may sabotage relationships or shit test the relationships or do things that are detrimental because of the homeostasis of the parent complex or the maladaptation. And the same thing goes for anima possession. So anima possession would be the similar thing. So where Jung had called the animus, that male in the woman, Jung had also called anima the woman inside of a man, although again, it is a relating function the way we modernly look at it. So a man can also learn about what a woman is by observing his mother, his sister, his aunts, his neighbors, his teachers, right? Celebrities, characters in novels. All of these things can collect to the idea of an anima inside of the man. And now that is his relating function as well. And it's not only a relating function to women. Either the animus or the anima can come out. For example, a woman in the corporate ladder may have an animus towards the glass ceiling problem, right? So she might have to tap into that animus in a constructive way, right? You can think of it this way, as opposed to in the nurturing way that might be, more gender role determined or traditional role determined, right? Say, so you can also see in the male anima, there can be an animus possession. So it's not only what does my ideal mate look like, or what my ideal woman is, or even my fantasy woman looks like. The anima possession may be something that hinders the male's relating function. Like, say, for example, in a mother complex, there could be some issues where the male, his mother babied him too much. And now he's looking for those situations where he's always babied, but then he also will shirk responsibilities and make his mate take care of those as a way of, allowing that mother function, that mother complex in maladaptation to have him reach homeostasis, right? So the idea here is anima possession in a male can be a strange relation to the feminine that could either be internal or the way we relate externally. And I think in balance, the anima as a relating function is simply like, well, a man can take care of his wife. A male can be, a male can rub his wife's feet and, understand, like, he can be a nurturing husband and a good boyfriend or something like this. These are all positive aspects of the anima as relating function. But if we see Paul is interesting because in a way, Paul kind of fits a role of anima, at least having to work through some anima-related complexes, let's say, because his mother is a Bene Gesserit. He's trained as a Bene Gesserit. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helena Mohim is a Bene Gesserit. They're all women in his life. Chani's a woman. His father dies, and there's all this kind of lineage of women, but he's expected to be this man beyond that. The man that comes out of this coven of women, right? This coven of Bene Gesserit witches produces this male, like super male. But in a way, he's not up to the task, right? He ends up becoming a tyrant, and then he rejects all of it. And I think that this is interesting because I'm wondering, I'm wondering, maybe someone in the comments out there who knows psychology better than I do, maybe they could comment on, what do you think the nature of Paul's anima possession is? Is it a thing? I mean, is there something to be spoken of this? And does it lead to his ability to not stick through with what Leto II ends up pursuing in his golden path, right? It's just an interesting side note, but leave comments below if you're interested. And guys, if I got something wrong or you have questions about it or you want to restate it, I'm always open to other opinions, just kind of calling it the way I call it. So we talked a little bit about the Alia's possession, kind of akin to an animus possession and a shadow possession. We talked about Paul briefly in the anima space. We can also look at Duncan, Idaho, in a bit, but let's kind of go into the idea of the tyranny of possession, right? So the idea of there's tons of different aspects of tyranny of possession. I think in Dune Messiah, Stilgar is very fascinated by Paul's ability to know the future. And he's like, can't you just look into the future and find the answer? And Paul's like, it doesn't work that way, Stilgar. It doesn't work that way. It's sort of, I'm in it, and if I make a move, it changes everything. So it's like the future is not separated from the now. And I think that this idea of the all-powerful ability to know the future, it creates in his followers, the cultish followers, a misconception of what the cult of his leadership is. So again, there's a possession by the cult, right? So the cult of the leadership, the cult of his own Muad'Dib myth, ends up being something that Paul rejects in Dune Messiah. And then he replaces it with becoming this desert preacher, right? He becomes the mad, blind preacher of the desert. And actually in Dune Revenant, we talk a little bit about this mad, blind preacher, right? We talk about Alia in the anima possession too. Like, I'll just give you a quick quote here. With going back to Alia, there's a quote, "The Vindication of Saint Alia." Okay, it's the idea of this is there's a play in the future about the vindication of Saint Alia. I think I always was upset about Alia. I always felt a bit, talk about my own anima possession, right? I kind of felt like, couldn't Duncan have helped Alia? Couldn't she have confided in someone, right? I always wanted her to be healed. I always wanted Alia to be healed. Like, she knows so much. And I guess we get that in the next generation, right? Ganima is not affected by possession. And Leto takes the golden path as his answer to his father's rejection of the golden path, right? So we sort of do see the generations are improving. So this is well in tune with Frank Herbert's idea of, that the human is an ongoing project through the generations. And we'll go into genomic pressures next, because I think that's a very interesting topic. But I just want to read from this. It says, this is from the play called The Vindication of Saint Alia from this fan fiction, Dune Revenant. I'm thinking of putting together a Dune Revenant edition that is a book of essays from these podcasts on Dune. And I'll also include this. Maybe it will be like the omnibus. We just did an omnibus of the Catu journals out of Lovecraft's Providence. This is new and hot off the presses here. We're in proof of this. But it's basically taking all the Catu journal writings, a genealogy of Cthulhu, psychoanalysis of Aurelia, archaeology of Yog-Sothoth, and the necromancy of Nyarlathotep we talked about. We're also going to talk about Hermeticism of Hastur, which has possession themes. So this is sort of the omnibus of all 6 of those volumes. It's got something for everyone in here. So I think I might do a collection like that in maybe the 30th anniversary of Dune Revenant. Will it be 30th anniversary? Yeah, coming up soon. Okay, so here's the quote. It says, "The Vindication of Saint Alia. Someone asks," so this is taken from the point of view of a play about the vindication of Saint Alia, but now imagine you are Alia in the throes of abomination possession. "Someone asks me a question, a new voice, very old." So here she is, she's in her other memories, and a voice comes up and asks a question. A new voice, very old. He quotes an even more ancient voice saying, and I believe this was like Nietzsche and Plato maybe. Maybe we're quoting Plato through Nietzsche. "So long as one always lays the blame on others, one still belongs to the mob. When one always assumes responsibility oneself, one is on the path of wisdom. But the wise man blames no one, neither himself nor others. Who says this? He asks, not only me. The crowd roars up for a moment and his voice fades. But I find his strength again." When she says the crowd roars up, that means the other voices that are crowding her mind, right? "The crowd roars up for a moment and his voice fades. But I find his voice again. He speaks of one who is ancient to him as he is ancient to me. He says, 'It was heard but forgotten.' No, it was not heard and forgotten. Not everything gets forgotten. But there was lacking an ear for it. Again the crowd, undone. I listened for the forgotten one to find an answer to the question, but instead I find he who asked. Did he say it to his own ear? Did he say it into his own ear? Yes, that is how it is. Wisdom is the whispering of the solitary to himself in the crowded marketplace. The crowd returns. He is gone. I am in awe of this one thing. So the idea is wisdom is the whispering of the solitary to himself in the crowded marketplace. Right? So the vindication of Saint Alia, that this quote to a fictional play that doesn't exist except in this fan fiction, the concept of it is, had Alia gotten that agency, right? And I think that the Duncan character is interesting because Duncan represents a very different role. Now, there he is supportive to Alia, very supportive to Alia throughout Dune, Children of Dune. But Duncan has a kind of possession of his own because he is a copy of the original Duncan. Right? So in Dune Messiah, we see that the Tleilaxu have created a Gola clone of Duncan Idaho, and they've removed his eyes and given him metal eyes, but he doesn't have the original memories of Duncan Idaho at first. But then something happens, and it was part of a Tleilaxu experiment to tap into those other memories. And then suddenly Duncan Idaho is able to remember just his past life, not all past lives. And that's going to be very key into books after God Emperor of Dune, in Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune. And it also is a key in Dune Revenant, where the Golas are now able to be woken up with their other memories. So maybe we can speak a little bit to the genome now. We kind of talked a little bit about psychological pressures, but let's talk a bit about genomic pressures. So the idea, maybe we can go into... Yeah, so the genomic pressures, I think, let's talk about things like ancestor worship first. We'll start off with ancestor worship. So basically, if we look at demonic possession, ancestor worship, Bene Gesserit, other memories, right? All of these have a similar flavor to them, right? And then we have this idea of the genomic succession, right? So if with ancestor worship, maybe we'll start with each of these domains. We'll kind of go into it. With ancestor worship, this is like a certain cultures have this idea of revering or creating a religious practice around the reverence and respect of departed ancestors. So it's like the ancestors continue to have an influence in the lives of the living, right? And that by honoring them and by sort of being present with the ancestral memories, or the idea of the memory of the ancestor, let's be clear, right? The memory of the ancestor. People can seek guidance from their ancestors or protection from them or blessings from them, right? So ancestor worship, you could have rituals and offerings. You can have photos of, just think of photos of our deceased grandparents or something like this, right? Great-grandparents deceased, we have their photos. You look at your parents' photos of their parents and grandparents, and you start to see that there's a kind of ancestor worship. Even the stories will come out when you look at those photos. Oh, I remember that time when grandma, your great-grandmother, and you kind of go down that lane. But in formalized ancestor worship cultures, I think this has a much more profound effect in which it's a formalization of the relation of the living to the ancestral. And in a strange way, anyone who's ever done a genealogy tour, if you start going through your genealogy and looking at how your family has gotten to where you are, not from a genetic side but just from a social, sort of an Adlerian side, let's call it, right? The social constructs of your ancestors. You can see some features repeating, like, say, for example, you might see mental illness recur, or you might see things like divorces might have happened, right? Some things like this that reoccur across generations, right? Now, if we go from the ancestor worship, which I think relates a bit to the idea of other memory, right? So the idea of other memory, the Bene Gesserit lineage, the idea of accessing the other memory, this is sort of a sci-fi version of ancestors in ancestor worship. But if we go into the deeper idea of genomic succession, now we're beneath the cultural and familial aspects of ancestor worship. Now we're looking at the context of genetic expression. Evolutionary biology, like genomic succession, is sort of inheritance of the genetic material, the genetic traits from the ancestors. So sort of like I know, it's like, say you're not an athlete, but you're strong, right? So you go to the gym and you just find that you're farm strong because you've come from farmers. This is sort of something that happens. People have these features. Now, everybody can train to be something, but everyone is sort of born with a genetic sort of, some people are taller, some people are bigger boned. These are things that are genetic markers. But those genetic traits help characterize the present. But in a strange way, we are beholden to those genetic markers because that's how we've come from that lineage. You cannot, your skin tone or your hair color or these things, if you want to be blonde but your hair is black, you have to do something to your hair because it will grow naturally a color that's in your genome, right? So it is a world shaping feature in the present. So, and also in that it's a genetic inheritance, and that genetic material is passed on from the ancestors to the descendants. And so genetic information going through the generations influences the traits, characteristics, even sometimes inherited health problems, right? These can be passed down to evolution. Now, this continuity of life and the species enhancement of this is also due to genetic expression. So the idea of the genetic succession as well, we've evolved into human beings from primates, and now we can think and we can have cities and we can do all these amazing modern things, right? So part of the improvement that Herbert sort of is trying to science fictionize in his Dune saga of, like, we have the mentats have perfected their thinking because of the Butlerian Jihad ban on thinking computers. The Bene Gesserit have total body control, so they don't even need medicine because they can change their body temperature. They can raise their white blood cell count by their will alone, right? So these kind of sci-fi features are really kind of analogs for the idea of the genomic succession. But in a way, there's a connection now, if we just take ancestor worship and genomic worship back to the psychological tree of these sort of possessions. So we talked a little bit about animus possession. We talked about anima possession, right? And I think that what we can do is let's go back to animus and anima, but let's now frame it in the sense of the genomic, the genome, and also the meta instincts that kind of go along with this, right? So, for example, if we look at Alia's animus possession, right? In the sense of Alia, she actually is the granddaughter or the granddaughter. She's the granddaughter of the Baron Harkonnen, right? So in a way, it's not just the sci-fi idea that the Baron's voice in her other memories possessed her because of the spice and the water of life and the abomination thing. She actually is the granddaughter of the Baron Harkonnen. So imagine if she was an alcoholic instead of an abomination, right? And Baron Harkonnen was also an alcoholic. It wouldn't be such hard stretch to say, well, it does run in the family. Alcoholism runs in the family, something like this, right? So the idea of it is in just a casual way, right? So the idea of, if it wasn't such a sci-fi topic, we would just say, well, she sort of inherited these tendencies from Harkonnen. But what we see in Herbert's treatment of her in Children of Dune is, it is more like a schizophrenia invoked by the animus possession, right? So this would also kind of tend towards the idea of some kind of schizophrenia as a inheritable concept as well, which I think that Freud talked about this some. I don't know, maybe someone who's up on this more modern interpretations of this, but I believe that they looked at something of schizophrenia skipping 5 generations, something to this effect. But I don't know if that's anecdotal. I'm not sure. I don't have a quote on that, but it's very interesting. If someone knows Freud talking about this, that would be interesting. A comment to leave below. We'll go back to Paul, let's say, in the idea of anima possession. And again, anima possession where Jung says that the unconscious feminine aspect of a male psyche. So Paul's prescience is sort of linked to the Bene Gesserit way, which is a female organization. And throughout the Dune, he's got a lot of feminine experiences and psyche experiences. The psyche even is feminine in a lot of ways, right? We mentioned the Reverend Mother, Gaius Helmreim, Lady Jessica, Chani. But then his journey, he kind of can see that he's been so influenced by these feminine figures that he sort of overcompensates almost to become this leader. But it's very interesting. We can kind of go back to it. But from a genomic pressure point of view, again, he's related to the Reverend Mother. She's his grandmother. Her and the Baron formed our Jessica's parents, basically. So Jessica is the daughter of the Reverend Mother. So it's actually not such a great mystery. I mean, even though in the Dune world, yes, she's a Bene Gesserit, yes, there's other memories, yes, the Baron Harkonnen is there, but it's actually a pure genetic link. And of course, Paul will exhibit some of these tyrannical things because the Harkonnen is a tyrant himself, right? So this is just sort of an interesting way of not to diminish at all from Herbert's approach, but it does kind of show how the genomic side of things helps to explain it. Finally, I think if we think about demonic possession, right? If you think about it in the sense of demonic possession, I think that the Tleilaxu and the Ixians are quite demonized in this. And I'm not going to say demonic possession by real demons, but in a weird way, Leto kind of becomes the demon, right? Leto says, I will let the spirit of the worm possess me. So Leto II's transformation is very much so closer to what a demonic possession looks like. So what happens in a demonic possession, right? Demonic possession is the other that is not human takes the human form. And I think nothing more describes this than Leto's, right? The malevolent spirit inhabits the person's body and controls his mind. And by the time of Emperor of Dune, we actually see the Moneo calls it the worm mind comes up over Leto, right? So with Leto's transformation, you start to see this idea of his possession by the sort of the demon of the worm. They call the worm Shaitan. They call it Satan, basically. And he's possessed by Satan in a strange way to become the tyrant, right? Okay, so I think we're close to wrapping up. A couple other points here. We've talked about, let's talk about ancestral influence. We talked about this, right? The idea of we bring the ancestor forward. We are the leading edge of our ancestors, right? So in a way, we are like the Kwitzat Haderach of our ancestors, right? Because we are the one that's still vibrant in the world. And we are the ones who can bring up their memories, right? And also the transference of traits. In demonic possession, they always have the things in the exorcism movies where people can speak in a different language. In God Emperor of Dune, because of his other memories, Leto II as the God Emperor, as the sandworm, he can speak all these ancient memories. He can speak in Aramaic. He says he speaks in Aramaic. Isn't that interesting? He's becoming Shaitan, and he speaks in Aramaic, right? There's also the strange possession of the ideologies, right? We have Paul's crusade. We've got the overarching Butlerian jihad concept. And interestingly enough, the Butlerian jihad is maybe influenced by, and we've talked about this in other places, but again, these are the kind of essays I'd like to put together in a revised, like Dune Revenant essay book. But Herbert talked about Samuel Butler, and Samuel Butler was a scientist who actually put forth the idea of the Gola technology. So the Gola technology is that you could have a clone, and you could somehow in the cells, the genetic memories are stored there, and you can awaken those. So just the way Duncan's Gola has his memories awakened, so too you could do that in the real world. So you can look up Samuel Butler and his idea of genetic memory. So in the sense of our memories are stored in the genome, and some experiments have been done with this, like with rats that are trained for generations to avoid a certain stimuli, and then the rats are taken at birth somewhere else, and they also retain that knowledge, like they learned from their ancestors, or they were cloned, and then they learned that ancestral memory. And it also kind of goes into the genetic memory of Samuel Butler. It also kind of speaks to the idea of transference of memory. So Butler's idea was used by Herbert to sort of give that character, Duncan Idaho, his great standing that happens in God Emperor of Dune. But we just see it starting in Children of Dune, because in Dune Messiah is when he's first awoken. But it also leads us to sort of this idea from Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake speaks on his morphic resonance and morphic fields. So some of those concepts are very interesting. So the idea of morphic resonance is linked to this. So the idea of consciousness is not created by the brain. It's sort of like the brain is the byproduct of consciousness, right? So it's actually the field And this kind of links back to Paul's prescience. He's not seeing the future. He's just able to sense the future. And any action he does changes the future. And this is why Paul saw all the roads leading to the end of mankind. And Leto said the only way we're going to save humanity is for me to become inhuman. And that's where the demonic possession becomes. He becomes like a demiurge. And we almost see a Gnostic story. Again, Frank Herbert's ethics. You can, guys, go check out that podcast if you're interested in the Herbert ethics side. I think that's very interesting. So yeah, we can kind of see, so wrapping it up, I guess we wrap it up in the sense of we've got genetic and ancestral memories as a kind of possession that we see. We have this idea of psychological possessions, whether it's shadow possession or anima and animus possession, and we see it through Alia, we see it through Paul, and we see Ganima, and we see Duncan, and we see Leto II kind of overcome this. And this is really, in the end, where agency kind of comes in, right? So the biggest difference between, let's say, what's the difference between other memory of the Bene Gesserit and abomination? And I think the difference is plain. It's the Bene Gesserit have a control of the other memory, and they're able to bring them up and they bring them down when they want to, because they have that core self, that ego strength they have. Where Alia is an abomination because she does not have the ego strength, and the voices end up taking over. So we have the idea of voluntary versus involuntary. So when it's possession, it's involuntary. When it's voluntary, it's like guided by spirits, right? When it's positive versus malevolent, when it's malevolent, it's a demonic possession, like the Baron takes over her body and forces her to do things to satisfy his lusts that she now participates in, or she even zones out while he takes over. Versus a positive use of it, it's like, say, when Leto reflects on, there's a great passage where he's remembering waking up in a village as a child, and he sort of like lives through that experience a bit and gives him perspective on the human plight. This is sort of a positive use of other memories, right? There's also a cultural view of it. The Bene Gesserit are quite strict in their rules. So there's a social stigma to being preborn, which I think I always found offensive a bit, that the Bene Gesserit could not just, with all their wisdom, find a program for the preborn, right? I think that like it's interesting. I mean, from a novel, it's more exciting to have abomination and witches and this kind of a witch hunt of the abomination, as opposed to having an integration mindset where they can train the abomination. But yeah. So again, agency is an important aspect of this. So agency is sort of referring to an individual's ability to act independently, understand themselves, and make choices based on the situation objectively by their own will and intentions, let's say, right? So having agency is sort of the opposite of being possessed, because possessed, it's like you surrender your agency over to some other, whether it's a demonic possession, right? So in many cases, I always think of, say, for example, an idea of like an involuntary possession. I think of like in the Bleach anime, when Ichigo becomes hollowified and he's in these super fights where he needs extra power, and suddenly he calls upon the hollow power, and then he just zones out while the demon takes him over, and then he wins the battle and he doesn't even know he's won, right? This is sort of like an involuntary possession. An involuntary possession is a bit more like having a guiding spirit. The ancestor worship is sort of a voluntary possession, right? And then there's metaphorical possessions, right? Like possessed by anger, possessed by ambition, because Alia is also possessed by the ambition that Harkonnen had. And Paul was possessed by ambition, right? And we see possessed by anger. We can, in God Emperor, Meneo's quote again, he says that the worm, that's the worm acting out when Leto would, as the worm, kills somebody, but in a way it's just possession by anger. So these various degrees of agency in these possession cases can really depend. They depend on a lot of things. And we see in Dune, it's obviously grounded in the social milieu of the Dune novels, just as our agency is grounded in our areas, right? And then I guess the alignment to the golden path. Maybe that's something if we want to talk about golden path, guys, go check out the God Emperor of Dune podcast we did, and we can talk a lot about the golden path. And this is where Leto uses his kind of possession by the worm to initiate a course of action for mankind, and you guys can jump into that. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully it was interesting to everyone. Leave your comments below. As usual, like and subscribe. You can check out our bookstore below. Catu journals out there, Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, Hermeticism, Hastur, helps to support the channel. You can read Dune Revenant on our Patreon. And as usual, I'm collecting our lectures here. I've got 2 of these published already. Jungian, I've got out there right now, Jungian Alchemy and Horror and Science Fiction, and Theosophical Psychoanalysis of Pulp Fantasy and Anime. Volume 3 will be coming later this year with Tolkien, Giordano Bruno, things on time and Atlantis. I'm also going to be working on the 4th volume, which was our Dragon podcast, and then the 5th volume, which will be on astrological Neptune, Saturn, all those. So go check out the bookstore. It helps to support us. And as usual, liking, subscribing helps to grow the channel. I'm trying to take this to a live stream. So hopefully this was interesting. We'll see you guys next time. And thanks for listening this long. Thanks to our Patreons and our subscribers. You guys make it all possible. So thank you. Bye-bye.